A lot of people have been asking me, Bear, what comes next? On YouTube, on Patreon, in person, via email, over and over again, what comes next? I can't say with certainty, but I can say with a high rate of statistical probability what I think comes next. And this is based upon the fact that I'm an amateur student of history and that I both produce and consume intel every day. So, in a nutshell, what comes next? I believe that NATO is going to get involved in the war in Ukraine. NATO is looking for a fight, it seems. And we don't need to delve into political leadership or the lack thereof. But suffice it to say, the powers that be have been given opportunities to take an exit ramp from a hot war, conventional warfare in Eastern Europe, and they haven't taken them. In fact, we're going the opposite direction, stacking troops, moving materiel, forming alliances, strengthening bonds with our allies. So I believe NATO, and therefore the United States, will get involved in a war in Eastern Ukraine. Potentially, when that happens, and officials from the DOD have been testifying before Congress saying that, hey, we don't have the capacity to fight a two-front war. We know this, our adversaries know this, and so there's a possibility that when NATO/the United States gets involved in the war in Ukraine, that China makes its move on Taiwan. How that shakes out is beyond the scope of this video. But war, I believe, is not only possible, but probable. Probably within the next year, but certainly within the next 3 years in the Indo-Pacific region, and likely within the next year in Eastern Europe for the United States and its allies. There's going to be a greater divide between East and West, if you will. Globalization is dependent upon the successful, easy flow of goods and services and money across international borders. And due to the issues of the last couple of years, that has become much more difficult. Add into that political tensions and political aspirations around the globe. And rather than one homogenized world economy, we're seeing a separation happening here. The United States and its allies, Europe and its allies, China and its allies, Russia and its allies, all pretty much doing their best to do business with their friends and their friends only. I think that's going to become more acute, not less acute over time, because war at its most basic level is a game of resources. Because of this, supply chains are going to continue to be exacerbated. They are going to get worse. And I have been saying for a couple of years now, what happens when the people who were rioting over Charmin 2 years ago realize that there's no food? We're already seeing with the baby formula shortage, a lack of food. That's food. And it doesn't simply matter whether or not you're allowed in the store. Did you do these two things and this other thing? That doesn't matter if there's nothing in the store for you to buy. That also doesn't matter if your dollar or whatever fiat currency you have or we have by the time this airs, if your fiat currency is so weak that you can't actually purchase anything with it, a la the Weimar Republic in Germany prior to World War II, where a loaf of bread had the equivalent value of a wheelbarrow of cash. So supply chains are going to continue to be exacerbated because of the lack of flow of goods and services globally. and the fact that, at least domestically here in the United States, we do not produce all the things that we need. Now, most countries don't produce all the things that they need domestically, and there's a lot of talk about, the U.S. having outsourced its manufacturing capabilities over the last several decades, and that's true. Those are problems. But we are not the only people with those problems, which means that it's not going to be just the United States that faces those challenges, but that's going to be more of a global issue rather than a domestic issue. That will lead to shortages and rationing, especially in light of war. If you look at things like World War I, World War II, where domestically people were encouraged to grow freedom gardens so that they would have vegetables and carbohydrates coming up in their backyard, something I think you should be doing now. Because domestically we had to support the war effort. There wasn't enough to go around. The citizenry were forced to make sacrifices on behalf of the war effort. Regardless of what your opinion of the war effort might have been or will be as we go into what will likely become World War III, the hot portion, the dynamic, kinetic portion of World War III. Regardless of how you feel about that, there's going to be shortages and rationing, I believe. Rationing is already happening, but it's happening in the form of, you can't buy 12 of these, you can only buy 1 or 2 of them at the store, right? There's limits to how many things you can buy. This is happening in retail, brick and mortar stores. It's also happening online. Things that you used to be able to add 20 to cart of, you can now only add 2 of, and that is soft rationing. We may not be standing in bread lines yet, but there is rationing going on, and I think that's only going to get worse. Now, as far as shortages, in the last 2 years, we went from 570 million tons globally of strategic grain reserves to roughly 70 million tons in the last 2 years of strategic grain reserves. Half of that is in China. Half of that is in China. And 70 million tons sounds like a lot, but it's about 2 weeks worth of food for everybody on the face of the earth. Yeah. So I also think, because of the insane amount of spending that we're seeing happening in the United States and elsewhere, coupled with the nosedive in the economy over the last couple of years, there's a strong possibility for fiscal insolvency for nation states and minute/major economic crises around the world. The United States is broke. We do not have the money to meet our obligations and our commitments. Even as we're building up to war, we see defense budgets being slashed. The Navy has been very vocal. The United States Navy has been very vocal about the fact that we don't have enough ships to do the things that you're asking us to do, and you're not giving us more money for ships. How do you think that's going to bode for us getting back to our first point, war? So, fiscal insolvency and/or economic crisis. Domestic inflation is actualized somewhere around 17%. So inflation is exceeding both the cost of living increases for people and the per annum annual raises that employees are experiencing. And it's also exceeding the vast majority of investment returns. So people are less likely to invest their money now, which lowers the velocity of the US dollar, which is a thing, which is an indicator. So that doesn't bode well for us either as far as economic crisis. Economic crisis will exacerbate the supply chain shortages and rationing issues that we've talked about, and will probably push us deeper into war because, again, war at its most basic level is a game of resources. The allocation of certain resources, usually men with guns, against the defense of or acquisition of other resources, usually energy, food, land, sometimes technology. Because of all of this, domestically, we're likely to see increased tyranny And that increased tyranny is actually a symptom of decreased legitimacy of our governing authorities. All governments strive for legitimacy, the best words, amongst the populace. But when the government can't meet its basic needs of the people, food, water, shelter, security, if the government can't meet those needs, that decreases the legitimacy of the governance in the eyes of the governed. Because of that, I believe, based upon history, the government will continue to act out, likely against what it considers to be its domestic political enemies, and somebody will become the bad guy, somebody to point the finger at. World War II, Holocaust, anybody? Somebody to point the finger at. But the lack of legitimacy will cause many to fail, unfortunately, those dependent upon the government, and also will create white space for bad actors to operate, essentially fourth generation warfare, insurgencies, and terrorism. So there will likely be political fractures, political chaos, if you will. And remember that the government's plan of continuity of government is just that. It's continuity of government in times of crisis, not continuity of you or me. It's not continuity of community. It's continuity of government. So, a decrease in legitimacy because of all of these domestic and international issues likely to occur. That will cause potential political chaos. That can cause denial of services. We've already seen over the last couple of years, if you didn't do these two things and this other thing, in many cases, you were denied service. And for things like the movies, a comedy show, leisure, a cruise or a vacation, okay, suck it up, buttercup, no big deal. But when this becomes access to fuel, access to energy, access to healthcare, access to food, access to education, that is going to further foment civil unrest because of denial of services. And denial of services is likely to increase, not decrease, because of the government losing its legitimacy or losing some of its legitimacy and therefore acting out and becoming more and more tyrannical. So, again, civil unrest and politicized domestic terrorism. By the way, terrorism is defined essentially as violence for political gain. We're already seeing a bunch of this in the United States. We have been seeing this since the run-up to the 2020 elections, likely to get worse in the 2022 midterms, and certainly to get worse come the 2024 presidential election. As a side note, one leader, Ice Cream Grandpa, has dementia. Another leader, Potato Grandpa, Vodka Grandpa, has some type of gut cancer and probably Parkinson's disease. And another leader, there's a spider over here distracting me. What's up, spider? Hot Chili Pepper, Asian Grandpa. He's not in great health either. And so, highly likely that there's regime change, whether it's fostered or fomented in 3 of the world's strongest nations within the next year or 2, I would say. That will add to the chaos, the civil unrest, and domestic terrorism because of how politicized everything has become. And things will continue to be highly politicized, I believe. There will be the haves and the have-nots. It will be us versus them. And we're not going to dive into all the rabbit holes as to why that is and whose fault that is, but it just is. All this, by the way, is to say, this is not a doom and gloom channel. This is not the 12 reasons the zombies are going to rape your dog and eat your children channel. What I want you to do is onboard the information so you can adjust your OODA loop. Observe, orient, decide, act. Many of us have been observing this stuff, but you haven't actually oriented on the fact that it's happening. You haven't onboarded the fact this is real. And because you haven't onboarded that information, you can't decide what your courses of action should be, and therefore you can't act. And so hopefully this information, as well as the intel briefs that we do on Patreon, link in the description, will motivate you and inform you so that you can take action. You can quit simply observing what is happening in the world. You can orient on the fact that it's happening, onboard that information, decide what to do about it, develop your courses of action, and then act, and then do it. Execute, execute, execute. So, an increase in civil unrest and domestic politicized terrorism. We're also likely at the same time going to see a wondrous combination of third generation, fourth generation, and fifth generation warfare. Third generation being large-scale conventional war, guns and tanks and bombs and planes, okay? Eastern Europe, Indo-Pacific region, for now, other fronts potentially to develop. Fourth generation warfare, which is terrorism and insurgencies, both domestically and internationally. There's already an uptick, and it's likely to continue because nature abhors a void, right? And if there's no big kids on the block, somebody will try and become the big kid on the block. And then fifth generation warfare, asymmetric warfare, cyber attacks and infrastructure attacks and controlling the narrative and spreading misinformation, right? All of these things are going to be happening at the same time because of all the issues that we've discussed already. And so to that point, especially with fifth generation warfare, I think we're going to see an ever increasing strong arm from the media and social media as far as controlling what they would deem misinformation. In fact, the reason currently that the intel briefs are now on Patreon rather than on YouTube is because of YouTube's misinformation policy. It has become literally impossible for me to deliver those intel briefs here on YouTube because I've got a target on my back, because they have noticed that my channel says things that it doesn't say, and the algorithm plows everything that I say to find transgressions in the eyes of YouTube so that they can remove my content and kill my live streams midstream, mid-sentence. And rather than becoming decisively engaged with an enemy that I cannot overtake, guerrilla tactics, we have advanced in the opposite direction so that we can live to fight another day. And that's sad AF. I don't like that. But this video is not about me, it's about you. I think you're going to see more of that. Is there some hope? You know, Elon bought Twitter. Yes, there's some hope. But the information cartels, Google and Twitter and MSNBC and Fox News and Meta, Facebook and Instagram, TikTok, the information cartels have their own agendas. And much like continuity of government is not continuity of you, the intel cartels, information cartels agenda is not concerned about your wants and needs and your convictions and your feelings. It's concerned about their strategic initiatives. And they've learned enough over the years to know that you may complain about it, but you won't quit participating. Soft tyranny, a slow boil, the frog in the pot. And so the media and social media will continue to do their best to spin and control the narrative on behalf of their handlers and their strategic partners, which will dovetail nicely into fifth generation warfare and the decreased legitimacy of the government, denial of services, and domestic terrorism. Very likely to happen, in my opinion. Which I think ultimately, as the government continues to lose legitimacy and the people do the cost-benefit analysis, I think that on a long enough timeline, it's very possible that we see balkanization of the United States of America. Meaning that we will break up into regions. And there may still be some federalized, centralized government. There probably will be. But the efficacy of that body to govern I think will be lower because of their lack of legitimacy. And I can easily see regions like Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Kansas, Missouri breaking away. And now they're the Republic of Arklataxahomas or whatever, right? I can easily see that happening. That has the potential to lead to small-scale and or large-scale civil war in the United States of America. And I want to be clear, all of this is because of, ultimately, resources. The battle for resources, the battle for power, the battle for fuel and food and energy and information. So that's where I think we're going. And I don't like that, and I would very much so like to be wrong. Begs the question, where do I think, or what do I think you can do about it? So, the first thing is you need to check your population density, and you may need to strategically relocate. In my circles, we call this coup hemp. Come out of her, my people, lest you partake of her sins and receive of her plagues. Written in the Bible, popularized by Pastor Joe Fox at Viking Preparedness. Don't be where the bad stuff is. How do I avoid breadlines and martial law? Don't be where it is. What happens if nukes fall from the sky? I wouldn't live near strategic targets, right? So, strategic relocation. A good way to determine if you need to strategically relocate is to do an area study where you are right now. Forward Observer channel has excellent information on how to do an area study. I also have videos on how to do an area study, which are in the free playlist here on YouTube called the Prepper Classroom. Walk you line by line through how to do an area study. So use those resources. If you're going to relocate, you should also do an area study of the places you're relocating to or considering to relocate to, so that you don't move from a bad place to a bad place. Just a different kind of evil, right? And so area studies are incredibly important, and you probably need to strategically relocate. 80% of the world's population lives within 50 miles of a coastline. So that means there's a 4 in 5 chance you live around too many people. That's a problem. You need an intel network, and you need to be developing your own intel, local intel, regional intel, national intel, international intel. Onboarding that information so that you can decide how to act. What are you going to do? And that also does into mutual assistance groups and or what we call tribe. The group of people you're going to do life with. You need a group of people to do life with because many hands make light work, right? As long as they're all working together, they make light work. They make a freaking headache if they're not working together. And so you guys need to get together now. Strengthen community now. Because in a lot of ways, it's not really what you know, although what you know is important. In many cases, it's who you know. We like to joke around here, we got a guy for that. We do. Praise the Most High, we do. Whatever it might be. Your dump truck needs repaired, got a guy for that. Skid steer won't run, got a guy for that. Four-wheeler needs tires, got a guy for that. Need the garden planted, got a girl for that. You know, need something built on your property, got a guy for that. Need training on handguns, got a guy for that. You know, pick your thing, whatever it is, got a guy for that. So that comes from having a network of people and fostering and growing that network of people. So you need a network of people. You need to stack resources: food, water, consumables, sanitation, precious metals, wink, wink. You need to stack resources and commodities now while you still can. While the dollar still has some purchasing power and resources are still available, you need to be stacking them. How much? Prepper Classroom channel or Prepper Classroom playlist on this channel. Go watch it. Talk through all of that. The resources you stack are simply to buy you time while you spin up your production. Remember Freedom Gardens we discussed briefly earlier? I truly believe you are going to need to be able to produce your own food. We're seeing national and international drought. We're seeing grain that isn't being planted, whether it's because of conflict in Eastern Europe, or because soil temperatures are too low, or because there's been too much rain in certain regions, or because of a lack of fertilizer for large-scale agriculture, industrial monocrop agriculture. And so if you can't get it from them because it's not available or your dollar doesn't have any value, where are you going to get it from? Hopefully your backyard. Community gardens, backyard gardens. If you live out here like I do, you should have a big, robust garden. You just should. I know it takes time. I know it's a lot of work because I have a big, robust garden. I'm well aware. And if I can do it with all the things I got going on, you can do it. And that gets back to your mutual assistance group as well. Help each other. It's not a group to drink coffee together once a month and talk about how much the government sucks. Go do stuff. You shall know them by their fruits, not by their blabbering mouths. So you need to produce resources. Obviously, not everything you need is going to be able to be produced by your lone homestead or your backyard in suburbia. I get this question a lot too, like, what does it take to have a fully self-sufficient homestead? And the answer is community, because there's no such thing as a fully self-sufficient homestead. Never has been. Homesteads exist within a community so that you have your neighbors to depend on. When you need fertilizer for your crops, you can go get some cow manure. Or when you need some hay, your neighbor has a hay field. Or when you need to get some lumber, you can borrow your neighbor's sawmill and cut some trees down. Or you need a gas can, or your truck got stuck in the mud and you need somebody to pull you out. Homesteads exist in community. They are not lone homesteads. And if you do some research on the settling of the American West, very rarely did individuals settle anything. They might have, what's that old phrase? Pioneers get killed, settlers get rich, right? They might have gone out there and killed all the bad guys, air quote. You colonizer, hey, shut up with that horse crap. They might have taken the land, but they didn't possess the land. The settlers did. And the settlers came in as groups of families so that they could provide security for one another, so that they could provide labor for one another, so they could provide resources for one another. So you need to produce resources. I would also strongly advocate you get out of debt for a couple of reasons. First of all, right now, you're servicing a debt load, which means that a portion of the money that comes into your household every week, every month, however often you get paid, is immediately going right back out the door. And for what? Probably a bunch of bullcrap. So get out of debt. Go just listen to Dave Ramsey. He's got all the moves. They've been proven a million times over, literally. Get out of debt so that you have more revenue now to do the things with. Secondly, and I hear this a lot, what do I care if I'm in debt when the world ends? When the financial system collapses, they can't get blood from a stone. It's like, if I can't pay him back and nobody else can pay him back, what's the problem? Well, my answer to that is twofold. The first is, if you look at history, no debt has ever gone unpaid. They will take your stuff, whether it's your land or your vehicles or your livestock or your whatever. They'll take something. You will pay that debt. And if you can't, subparagraph B, I think debtors' prisons are going to come back. Forced labor, especially when we get into a lack of legitimacy, which will very likely lead to a further crumbling of infrastructure, Welcome to the chain gang. Couldn't pay your debts, so now you're in an orange jumpsuit with a sledgehammer turning big rocks into little rocks because we need the riprap to reinforce this, railroad track. Yeah. They would never do that in the United States. Adjust your OODA loop. They would never is not a phrase we get to say anymore after the last 2 years. So, Proverbs is real. A debtor is a slave to his debt. The rich rule over the poor, and a debtor is a slave to his debt. So if you'd like to be a slave and pay for all that debt with your blood, sweat, and tears and potentially your life, go for it. I don't want that for you, though. 2 more points. Second to last, you need to be training and you need to be teaching. Every one of you has a certain gifting or talent or delight. There's stuff you know that the people you're doing life with need to know, and you need to teach them that. Not only so that they learn, but also so that you relearn. The best way to learn something is to teach it. Flip side of that, you need to be training on everything. How to grow gardens, how to run rifles, small unit tactics, how to convoy, how to gather intelligence, how to set up a checkpoint, how to trim goat hooves, how to cook food for 50 people, how to preserve meat, how to butcher an animal, how to spin yarn, how to put in swales. All these things you need to be training. And so within your group, you should set a schedule up, ideally every week, but at a minimum every month, where you get together and you discuss the governance of your body, your group of people, but then you do stuff. Actual training stuff. Again, not sitting around and drinking coffee and complaining about how things should be. Start building what will be for you now. Mike Shelby from Forward Observer has an excellent phrase. We need to create first world zones in a third world nation. And I think, unfortunately, the United States is headed in that direction. And so if you don't put in the effort now to create that first world zone where you are, somebody else will decide for you what that zone is going to look like. And I think that's really bad. Lastly, and most importantly, none of this matters if you're just gonna die anyway. And I'm a bad apologist, and I'm an even worse evangelizer. But I will tell you, you need to get right with your Creator. I don't care who you are. I don't care what you've done. I don't care how bad the things that you've done are. I don't care how much blood guilt you have on your hands. I don't care if you think you're unforgivable. The Creator of the universe killed himself for you so that you could come home again. Says the guy who's done every bad thing there is to do. I blew $1.4 million in 2 years on cocaine and bourbon. I played drums in satanic metal bands for a decade. I'm a walking billboard for unrighteousness with all these tats. And yet and still I am covered by the blood of the Lamb. Nothing I've discussed thus far matters if you are not covered by the blood of the Lamb. If you're not part of the party, part of the family. See, preparedness is perpetuating normalcy for the people that we love. Right? We want to extend the length of and quality of life for the people that we love as much as possible by taking positive action now. What does that matter if when you die, you are eternally separated from everything that is good, from all the light, from the source of life? In short, it doesn't matter. And so you need to get right with the Most High. You need to humble yourself, put your knees on the ground and confess, hey man, I am a broken, messed up piece of garbage. And yet, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. I belong to you. I acknowledge that. I acknowledge that the Son is my Redeemer. I want to be washed in his blood. I want to come home again, and I want to walk in his steps. I want you to send me your Holy Spirit, your Ruach HaKodesh, for wisdom and discernment, and for strength and power and authority to walk righteously to the best of my ability, to do many mighty works in your name, to be a living witness, to forsake not the widow and the orphan, to be a leader of my home, to be a good man, and to be a son of the Most High. And if you can't truthfully say with everything that you've got, with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, that you are a son or a daughter of the Most High, the rest of this doesn't matter. Bless y'all. Shalom.